The most dangerous human in the room is always the one who doesn't react. And when the sound of that slap echoed through the diplomatic chamber, sharp against glass and steel, Ethan Cole simply stood there, his head turning an inch, no more, a faint line of red at the corner of his mouth catching the sterile white light, while 30 pairs of alien eyes waited for anger that never came. The room smelled of ionized air and polished metal. Temperature locked at 68 degrees, the kind of perfect balance designed for negotiation, not humiliation. Yet Ambassador Lyra Vexis didn't look away, her tall frame still, her blue-violet skin reflecting the overhead panels like cold water under moonlight, her hand lowering slowly as if the gesture had been calculated, not emotional. And Ethan, dressed in a simple charcoal suit tailored to hide more than it revealed, adjusted his cuff with steady fingers, his pulse steady, breathing even, as if nothing had happened at all, to the council. It looked like submission, a lesser species accepting its place. But to Lyra, it was data, a reaction measured in absence, because she had read the file, the one marked with layers of clearance no ambassador was supposed to access, the one that described Earth not as a developing world, but as a death world, gravity higher than standard, ecosystems hostile, evolution unforgiving. And Ethan Cole, former survival specialist, had lived where most species wouldn't last an hour. Apologies, Ambassador, he said quietly, voice level, American accent softened by years off-world. And that only made the silence heavier, because it wasn't fear, it wasn't weakness, it was control, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing not to show it. Lyra stepped closer, close enough that the faint warmth of her presence brushed against him, her golden eyes narrowing, searching for something beneath the calm surface. Your species fascinates me, she said, her voice smooth, almost curious now, and Ethan met her gaze for just a second, not challenging, not yielding, just present, as if he were standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere colder, harsher, a place that had taught him restraint the hard way. Across the chamber, a guard shifted, armor plates whispering, the only movement in a room frozen by tension, and Ethan's watch flickered once, a subtle pulse of data across its dark screen, unnoticed by everyone except him, a silent alert, a change in environmental pattern, pressure differentials where there should be none, and still, he didn't move, because reacting too soon was the same as reacting wrong. Lyra studied him another heartbeat longer, then turned away, as if satisfied. But the smallest crease formed between her brows, something she couldn't quite name, because she had expected anger, maybe defiance, something predictable, and instead she found something far more unsettling. Patience, the kind that waits, the kind that decides. And Ethan Cole, the man who didn't raise his hand, stood perfectly still as the distant hum of the station shifted just enough to signal that something was about to go very, very wrong. The hum shifted again, low and almost beneath hearing, but Ethan Cole felt it through the floor before the instruments confirmed it. A subtle vibration traveling up through polished alloy into the bones of his feet, and his eyes moved once, not enough for anyone to notice, just a fraction toward the far wall, where the light panels flickered half a degree dimmer, while across the chamber Ambassador Lyra Vexis continued her measured walk toward the central console, her posture flawless, every step deliberate, unaware that the perfect symmetry of the room had already been broken. You did not react, she said without turning, her voice carrying easily in the controlled acoustics, and Ethan adjusted his sleeve again, buying a second, his mind already mapping exits, distances, angles. Reaction is not always required, he replied, calm, steady, as if they were still discussing protocol rather than something far more fragile, and Lyra paused, just slightly, as though the answer had not satisfied her. Or perhaps, she continued, you were incapable, and a few members of the council shifted at that, their confidence returning in small, quiet ways, mistaking silence for weakness. Ethan did not respond this time, because the alert on his wrist pulsed again, stronger, a cascade of data resolving into a pattern he recognized, not from this station, but from somewhere harsher, somewhere that did not give warnings twice. And he finally lifted his gaze fully, scanning the perimeter with a technician's detachment, counting 8 security personnel, 2 access corridors, 1 primary door now sealed tighter than before. which meant the system had already begun compensating for something it did not understand. Lyra turned back toward him then, studying his face with sharper focus. "You are thinking about something else," she said, and for the first time there was a hint of curiosity rather than superiority, and Ethan met her eyes again, holding it a second longer this time, enough to signal a shift without explaining it. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "has this station reported any irregularities in the last 30 seconds?" And the question landed wrong, out of place, drawing attention in a way his silence never had, and Lyra's expression tightened, not with fear, but with calculation, because she had learned to recognize patterns too, even if they were different from his. "No," she answered, but her hand moved toward her console anyway, fingers hovering above the interface as if reconsidering that answer, and that was when the lights dipped again, longer this time. A ripple moving across the chamber like a shadow passing overhead, and the temperature control stuttered, dropping a single degree before stabilizing. A small error, almost nothing, unless you knew how systems failed under pressure. Ethan exhaled slowly, the first visible change in him since the slap, and straightened his posture by an inch, not defensive, not aggressive, just ready, while around them the council began to murmur, low voices filling the edges of the room, uncertainty spreading in quiet waves, and Lyra finally pressed her hand to the console, pulling up a stream of diagnostics that scrolled faster than most could read, her eyes narrowing as she followed the anomalies cascading through subsystems that should not have been connected. "What is happening?" she asked, not to the room, but to him, and it was the first time the question carried weight, because now she was not testing him, she was listening, and Ethan glanced once more at the sealed door, then back at her, his voice still calm, still controlled, but no longer distant. "Something is inside the station," he said, and it did not come through the front door. And the silence that followed was no longer about humiliation or pride, but about realization, slow and heavy, settling into every corner of the chamber as the hum beneath their feet grew just a little louder. The hum did not rise all at once. It layered itself into the air, thin at first, like a distant engine cycling beyond the hull, then sharper, more deliberate, and Ethan Cole tilted his head a fraction as if listening to something no one else could hear, while across from him Ambassador Lyra Vexis watched his expression change for the second time since she had struck him, and that alone was enough to tighten something in her chest that she refused to call concern. The council chamber lights steadied, but the color temperature shifted colder by a few degrees, washing the room in a pale blue that flattened every surface, and the environmental display on Lyra's console flickered between stable and warning before settling on a status that made no sense. All systems nominal, yet none of them behaving as designed. "Explain," she said, her voice no longer dismissive, and Ethan stepped closer to the central platform, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving as though he had already accepted that whatever came next would require him to be exactly where he stood. "It is not an external breach," he said, eyes scanning the ceiling seams, the vent lines, the invisible joints where systems met and trusted each other to hold. "If it were, your sensors would be screaming." And he lifted his wrist slightly, the dark face of his watch reflecting a brief cascade of symbols before dimming again. "This is internal, adaptive, something learning the system as it moves through it." And the words settled uneasily over the chamber, because they implied intent, and intent meant something far more complicated than a simple malfunction. One of the council members spoke up, a tall figure with translucent skin that shimmered under the lights. "You are suggesting sabotage," and Ethan shook his head once, slow, precise. "Sabotage follows a plan," he replied. "This is adjusting in real time." And Lyra's fingers moved across her console, pulling deeper layers of data, isolating subsystems, only to watch them reconnect in patterns that defied protocol, pathways opening and closing without command, like a maze rearranging itself. The hum shifted again, and this time it came with a faint pressure in the air, a change so slight most would ignore it, but Ethan inhaled once, measuring it, and his posture aligned fully, shoulders squared, weight balanced, no longer the posture of an assistant, but something else, something trained to meet uncertainty without hesitation. "Can it reach this room?" Lyra asked. And there it was, not fear, but the edge of it, the acknowledgement that control might not be absolute. And Ethan looked at the sealed doors, then at the ceiling, then back to her. It already has, he said quietly, and for a moment nothing happened, which somehow made it worse, because the silence stretched, heavy and expectant, and then the chamber doors emitted a soft click, not opening, not failing, just responding, as if something on the other side had tested them and decided to wait. The guards shifted positions, their formation tightening by instinct. But Ethan raised a hand slightly, not commanding, not forceful, just enough to pause. Do not rush it, he said, voice still even. If it is learning, then it is also watching how you react. And Lyra turned to him fully now, studying the man she had dismissed minutes ago, seeing the difference not in what he did, but in what he chose not to do, the restraint, the patience, the control that did not come from weakness but from understanding consequences. What would you do? She asked. And the question changed everything, because it was no longer a test, it was trust, tentative and unfamiliar, and Ethan met her gaze, steady, grounded, as the hum beneath them deepened into something that felt almost like a heartbeat. I would let it think it has the advantage, he said, because the moment it believes that, it will reveal what it really is. And somewhere beyond the walls, something shifted in response, subtle, precise, as if it had heard him. The room did not change all at once. It tightened, like something unseen had wrapped invisible hands around the space and begun to test its limits. And Ethan Cole felt it in the way the air moved, slower now, more deliberate, as if every system was being observed before it was touched, while Ambassador Lyra Vexis stood perfectly still beside the console, her eyes no longer scanning data, but watching him instead, measuring not his words, but his stillness. The guards held their positions, weapons lowered but ready, their training caught between instinct and uncertainty, because nothing had attacked, nothing had revealed itself, and yet everything felt wrong in a way no protocol had prepared them for. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself, his gaze moving once more along the edges of the chamber where the architecture met the technology, where seams existed not for design but for function. And he spoke without raising his voice. It is mapping behavior, he said, not just systems. And one of the council members frowned, confusion overtaking confidence. Behavior does not affect structural integrity. The figure replied, and Ethan glanced at them briefly, not dismissive, just certain. It does if the system is built to respond to it, he said, and Lyra's fingers hovered again above the console. But this time she did not touch it, because she understood the implication. Every input they made was being learned. Every correction fed the pattern. The hum beneath the floor shifted again, less mechanical now, more rhythmic, like a signal repeating and refining itself, and the chamber lights dimmed for half a second before returning. Not a failure, but a recalibration, and Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the first sign that something had crossed from observation into concern. Then we stop reacting, Lyra said, her voice low but firm, and Ethan nodded once, approving not the authority but the decision. Exactly, he replied, and the room settled into an unnatural stillness, conversations cut short, movements minimized, even the guards adjusting their stance to reduce unnecessary motion, turning a chamber built for diplomacy into something closer to a held breath. Seconds stretched, each one longer than the last, and then a panel along the far wall released a soft hiss, not opening fully, just enough to suggest access had been achieved and reconsidered, like a door tested but not yet chosen. And several heads turned instinctively before stopping themselves, remembering too late what Ethan had said, and that hesitation, that correction, echoed louder than any alarm. Lyra stepped closer to him now, not invading his space, but no longer distant, her presence aligned with his rather than above it. If it is watching, she said quietly, then it already knows we are aware. And Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes still scanning. Awareness is not the same as understanding, he replied, and his gaze settled briefly on a narrow seam in the ceiling where a faint distortion bent the light just enough to reveal something moving behind it. Not visible, not tangible, but present, and he added, almost to himself, and it does not understand restraint yet. The temperature dropped another degree, subtle but undeniable now. and the system compensated a moment later, overcorrecting by half. A small imbalance that would have been ignored minutes ago, but now felt like a message, and Lyra followed his line of sight, her expression tightening as she noticed the same distortion, the same imperfection in an otherwise flawless structure. "It is here," she said, not as a question, and Ethan nodded once, calm returning to his voice as if certainty itself was a form of control. "It has been here," he answered. "We are just finally seeing where it chose to show itself." And as if in response, the distortion shifted, just slightly, enough to confirm that whatever was inside the station had heard them, and had decided it was time to be noticed. The distortion did not vanish when they saw it. It held its place, a faint bending of light along the ceiling seemed like heat above asphalt, and Ethan Cole did not move toward it, did not point, did not acknowledge it in any obvious way. Because acknowledgement was a reaction, and reaction was information. While beside him Ambassador Lyra Vexis kept her posture aligned with his, her earlier authority reshaped into something quieter, more precise. Her eyes fixed on the same imperfection, but her hands deliberately still. The chamber had fallen into a controlled silence now. No shifting armor, no whispered exchanges. Even the environmental systems seemed to hesitate between cycles, as if unsure whether to continue or wait. And in that stillness, the hum beneath their feet refined itself again, no longer searching, but focusing, narrowing its pattern into something almost intentional. Ethan's breathing remained steady. One inhale, one exhale, measured and even, the rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that control begins with the smallest systems first, and he spoke without turning his head, his voice low enough that it belonged to the space between them rather than the room itself. "It is testing boundaries," he said. "Not the walls, not the doors, but us." And Lyra's gaze did not leave the distortion as she answered. "Then it expects us to fail." And Ethan allowed the smallest shift of expression, not quite a smile, but recognition. "Everything does, at first," he replied. The distortion pulsed once, subtle, almost like a ripple passing through invisible glass, and a thin line of condensation formed along the seam beneath it, where temperature gradients no longer aligned with system output, a detail so small it would have been dismissed under normal conditions. But now it felt deliberate, placed, as if whatever occupied that space wanted them to notice without fully revealing itself. One of the guards adjusted his stance a fraction, the faint scrape of boot against floor breaking the perfect stillness, and the distortion reacted immediately, tightening, compressing inward by an inch before returning to its previous shape. And Ethan's eyes flicked to the guard, not reprimanding, just noting. While Lyra saw it too, the cause and effect, the direct correlation between motion and response. "It is learning faster than projected," she said quietly, and this time there was no distance in her voice. No superiority, only calculation layered with something new, something closer to respect, and Ethan nodded once. "Because we are teaching it," he answered, and the words carried weight, not accusation, but responsibility. Lyra considered that, her mind moving through possibilities, protocols, contingencies that now felt inadequate, and for the first time she stepped half a pace behind him rather than beside him, not surrendering control, but repositioning it, aligning herself with the one person in the room who understood the pattern unfolding around them. The chamber lights flickered again, but this time they did not return to the same intensity. They stabilized at a slightly dimmer level, as if something had decided that this was the new baseline, and the hum beneath them settled into a steady cadence. No longer searching, no longer adjusting, but waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes still on the distortion, and then, very carefully, he shifted his hand, not toward it, not away. Just enough to create a minimal change in posture, a controlled variable, and the distortion responded, not by retreating, but by holding perfectly still, matching his restraint with its own. And in that moment the pattern became clear, not through data, not through sensors, but through behavior. "It is not just observing," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "It is mirroring." And Ethan finally turned his head a fraction toward her, meeting her gaze with calm certainty. "Now you understand," he said, and the realization settled between them like a new kind of gravity, because whatever was inside the station was not simply a threat to be contained. It was something learning how to be them, one reaction at a time. The realization did not bring relief. It brought precision, and Ethan Cole adjusted his stance by a fraction of an inch, not to challenge the presence above them, but to control what it learned next, because if it was mirroring, then every movement mattered, every breath, every hesitation, and across from him Ambassador Lyra Vexis understood that now in a way she had not minutes ago. Her stillness no longer an act of authority but a deliberate choice, the distortion. Along the ceiling seam held its shape, no longer flickering, no longer uncertain, as if it had reached a temporary equilibrium with the room, and the hum beneath their feet settled into a steady frequency that felt almost synchronized with the silence itself. Ethan's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, mapping the space again, but this time with a different purpose, not identifying threats, but defining boundaries. Invisible lines that would guide what the entity could and could not infer, and he spoke softly. "Do not give it complexity," he said. "Keep everything simple, predictable." And Lyra inclined her head slightly, absorbing the instruction, translating it into action without questioning his authority, because the evidence was no longer theoretical, it was present, responding. One of the council members shifted as if to speak, then stopped, catching themselves mid-motion, and the distortion reacted with a subtle ripple that matched the incomplete gesture, as though it had learned the intention even without the action completing, and that detail tightened the space further, because it meant the entity was not only mirroring what was done, but anticipating what might be done. Ethan noted it immediately, his gaze narrowing just enough to mark the change. "It is extrapolating," he said quietly, filling gaps, and Lyra's eyes returned to the seam, her voice lower now, more controlled. "Then silence is not enough?" And Ethan nodded once. "Correct. Silence is data too," he replied, and for a moment neither of them moved, testing that theory, and the distortion held steady, neither advancing nor retreating, as if waiting for a clearer signal. The chamber lights dimmed another fraction, not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm that the system was no longer maintaining its original parameters. It was adapting to a new standard defined by something other than its programming, and Ethan took a slow breath, then did something different, something intentional. He shifted his hand again, slightly more than before, a controlled increase in movement, and the distortion responded not by matching it exactly, but by smoothing itself, reducing its visible presence, as if learning that less was more. Lyra watched closely, her mind aligning with his approach, and she mirrored him, not the entity, but Ethan, adjusting her own posture by a measured degree, creating a consistent pattern, and the chamber responded with a strange kind of balance, the hum stabilizing further, the lights holding steady, the distortion maintaining a fixed position without fluctuation. "It is calibrating to us," she said, and this time there was no uncertainty in her tone, only recognition, and Ethan allowed a quiet exhale. "Then we decide what it learns," he answered, and that shifted the dynamic entirely, from reaction to control, from observation to influence. The guards remained still, following the unspoken command that had formed in the room, their discipline now part of a larger strategy they did not fully understand, and the council members, once confident in their authority, now held their silence not out of confusion but out of necessity. The distortion pulsed once more, softer this time, almost tentative, and for the first time since it had been noticed, it did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like a response, and Ethan's gaze remained steady as he spoke one final time, his voice calm but carrying a quiet weight. "It is learning what we are," he said, "so make sure it learns the right thing." And as if in acknowledgement, the distortion stilled completely, matching their restraint with perfect precision, and in that shared stillness, the line between observer and observed began to blur. The stillness held longer this time, not fragile, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if the entire chamber had agreed to become something simpler, something easier to read, and Ethan Cole did not break that pattern, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence reduced to the minimum required to exist without adding noise, while beside him Ambassador Lyra Vexis mirrored that discipline with growing precision, her earlier instincts replaced by measured control, and for the first time since the disturbance began, the room felt balanced, not because the threat was gone, but because it had stopped pushing. The distortion along the ceiling seam softened, its edges less defined now, not disappearing, but integrating into the environment in a way that suggested it was no longer testing boundaries. It was adapting to them, and the hum beneath their feet shifted again, lower, smoother, almost aligned with the station's original systems, as if whatever had entered was learning how to belong. Ethan's eyes moved once, slowly, tracking that change, and he spoke in a tone that barely carried beyond Lyra. "It is stabilizing," he said, and she inclined her head slightly, her gaze never leaving the seam. "Because we are," she replied, and the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than any command, because it confirmed the pattern, behavior shaping outcome. A faint indicator light on the console flickered from amber to soft white. Not a full system recovery, but a shift toward normal parameters, and one of the council members exhaled audibly before catching themselves. The sound small but sharp in the controlled silence, and the distortion reacted, not by expanding or retreating, but by pausing, holding its form as if considering that sound, that release, and Ethan noticed immediately, his voice calm but firm. "Hold it," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with enough clarity that the room responded, breath steadying, movement freezing again, and the distortion resumed its softened state, confirming the connection. Lyra stepped half a pace forward, aligning herself fully with Ethan now, no longer observing him but working with him, her voice quiet but certain. "If it mirrors restraint, then it will also mirror escalation," she said, and Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he replied, "which means we choose the threshold." And that realization settled over them like a new form of authority, not imposed, but earned through understanding. The chamber lights brightened slightly, returning closer to their original intensity, and the temperature stabilized within 1/10 of a degree, small corrections that indicated the system was no longer being overridden, but influenced, guided by the absence of conflict rather than the presence of control, and Ethan allowed himself a slow inhale, not relief, but acknowledgement, because this was not over. It had simply changed. The distortion shifted once more, but this time it did something different. It thinned, stretching along the seam before settling into a near invisible line, as if it had learned how to remain without being seen, and Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly at that, understanding the implication. "It is choosing subtlety," she said, and Ethan's gaze remained steady. "Because it learned that from us," he answered, and the words carried a quiet warning, not of danger in the immediate sense, but of something more enduring. The hum beneath them faded into the background, indistinguishable now from the station's normal operation, and the chamber, once tense and unstable, returned to a surface-level calm that felt almost deceptive, because beneath it, something had changed, something had learned. Lyra turned her head slightly toward Ethan, her voice softer than before, stripped of rank and distance. "You knew this would happen," she said, not accusing, not praising, simply stating what she now understood, and Ethan did not look at her, his eyes still on the seam where the distortion had nearly vanished. "I knew it could," he replied, and after a brief pause, he added, "What matters is what it does next." And as if answering that thought, the seam above them shimmered once, barely perceptible, a final adjustment, before settling into perfect stillness, leaving the room quiet, controlled, and no longer entirely alone. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the structure of the chamber like a new foundation, and Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, eyes fixed on the seam that now showed nothing at all, because that absence was the signal, not the presence. While beside him Ambassador Lyra Vexis allowed herself a single controlled breath, slower than before, deliberate, testing whether even that would change the balance they had established. Nothing reacted, not immediately, and that was what made Ethan's gaze narrow slightly, because the entity had stopped responding in visible ways, which meant it had moved beyond simple mirroring, beyond direct feedback, into something quieter, something internal. The station systems began to normalize in layers, not all at once, but in measured increments, lighting returning to full spectrum, temperature stabilizing at 68 degrees, air circulation smoothing into its standard cycle, and the console in front of Lyra cleared its cascade of anomalies, replacing them with a calm, almost reassuring display that read as fully operational. Yet neither of them trusted it, not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. It adapted, Lyra said softly, her voice carrying the weight of realization rather than uncertainty, and Ethan shifted his stance by a fraction, not enough to disrupt the pattern, just enough to confirm something for himself. And when nothing reacted, he nodded once. It learned how to stop being seen. He replied, and that statement settled heavier than anything that had come before, because invisibility was not absence, it was control. One of the guards glanced toward the door, a brief, instinctive check, and this time there was no ripple, no response. The system did not acknowledge the movement at all, and that was when Ethan understood the next phase, his voice lowering slightly as he spoke. It is no longer reacting to us, he said. It is anticipating us. And Lyra's eyes shifted from the seam to the console, then back again, her mind aligning the pieces. Then it does not need to mirror anymore, she said, and Ethan gave a small nod. Exactly, he answered. Now it chooses. The chamber felt larger suddenly, not physically, but perceptually, as if the boundaries they had defined were no longer relevant, because whatever had been contained within them had expanded beyond those limits without moving at all. And Lyra straightened, not in authority, but in awareness, her presence sharper now, more focused. If it chooses, she said, then it can decide how we see it. And Ethan's gaze remained steady. Or if we see it at all, he replied. The console emitted a soft tone, not an alarm, but a notification. And Lyra glanced down to see a single line of text appear, not generated by any known system process, not flagged as an error, just present. And for a moment she did not read it aloud, because the act of acknowledging it felt like a step, a movement, a signal, and Ethan noticed her hesitation, his voice calm but firm. Go ahead, he said. It already knows you saw it. And she exhaled once, then focused on the display, her voice steady as she read the message. Stability achieved, and the simplicity of the words carried a weight that none of the council protocols could explain, because it was not a system status. It was a statement. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his posture settled, not relaxed, but resolved. That is not for us, he said quietly, and Lyra looked at him, understanding forming even before he explained. Then who? She asked, and Ethan finally shifted his gaze away from the seam, meeting her eyes fully for the first time since the disturbance began. For itself, he answered, and the realization landed with a quiet finality. Because whatever had entered the station had not just learned how to behave, it had learned how to decide, and as the chamber stood in perfect, controlled silence, the absence above them felt heavier than any presence ever could. Nothing moved, and that was the final signal, not the alarms that never came, not the systems that now reported perfect stability, but the absence of reaction where there should have been one. And Ethan Cole stood in that silence with a stillness that no longer felt like restraint, but like recognition, while Ambassador Lyra Vexis slowly lowered her gaze from the console, the words still lingering in her mind, not as data, but as intent. The chamber had returned to its original state in every measurable way, lighting calibrated, temperature steady at 68 degrees, air composition within ideal parameters, and yet every being in the room felt the difference. A subtle shift in the space itself, as if something had rewritten the rules without altering the structure. Ethan finally moved, just a step, controlled, deliberate, and for a moment several heads turned instinctively before catching themselves. But nothing responded, not the walls, not the systems, not the invisible presence that had once mirrored every motion, and that confirmed what he already knew. It is done. Reacting, he said quietly, not to the room, but to Lyra, and she watched him now with a clarity that had not existed before, the distance between Ambassador and Aide gone, replaced by something more precise, more honest. No, she replied, her voice steady. It has moved beyond reacting. And Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the correction, because she understood now. The guards relaxed by a fraction, not fully, but enough to signal that the immediate tension had passed, and the council members began to shift, cautious, uncertain, testing the edges of what felt safe again. But Ethan's gaze lifted once more to the seam above, where nothing could be seen, and yet everything had changed, and he spoke again, his tone even, grounded. "Do not assume it is gone," he said, and the room stilled once more, not out of fear, but out of respect for the pattern they had just witnessed. Lyra stepped forward, standing beside him once more, not behind, not above, but aligned her. Presence no longer defined by authority alone, but by understanding, and she looked up at the same empty space, her voice softer now, but carrying further than before. "Then what is it doing?" she asked, and Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that marked a conclusion rather than a beginning, and answered without hesitation, "It is deciding what we are worth." And the words settled over the chamber with a quiet weight that no one challenged, because they all felt it, the sense that something unseen had observed them, measured them, and reached a conclusion that had not been spoken aloud. The console emitted one final, soft tone, and the message remained unchanged, stability achieved, but now it felt different, not a system report, not a reassurance, but a record, a line drawn between what had been and what would follow, and Lyra's eyes lingered on it for a moment longer before she turned away, her posture straightening, not in pride, but in acknowledgement. Ethan adjusted his sleeve. Once more, the same simple motion from the beginning, but now it carried a different meaning, not concealment, not restraint, but closure, and he glanced at Lyra briefly, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding that needed no words, because both of them knew that whatever had been in the room had not left. It had simply chosen not to be seen anymore. The chamber doors unlocked with a soft click, the first true signal of normal operation, and one by one the council members began to move again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, returning to the roles they understood. But Ethan did not move toward the exit, not yet, his gaze lingering on the space above for one last second, as if listening for something deeper than sound. And in that final moment, the silence answered him, not with absence, but with presence, calm, controlled, and watching, just as he had been. And Lyra Vexus understood then what no report would ever capture, that the most important thing in that room had not been power or protocol, or even survival, but the choice not to act, the decision to hold back when every instinct demanded otherwise, because in a place where everything was measured by strength, it was restraint that had been learned, and that was the only reason they were still standing. Ethan turned toward the door at last, his voice low, almost lost in the returning hum of the station. It did not